recorded. So if you miss anything about the during the briefing, or you want to share it afterwards or just revisit it, there will be a link sent out to everybody who's registered to attend. So don't worry if you do miss anything. Can I just draw your attention, please, to the fact that while it's fantastic that people like to share about our events on social media, and for that the hashtag is COVID School Response, could we ask that if you're going to include photographs, please not to include comments which others have posted into the chat function? Because these kind of spaces can be very empowering and cathartic for people to share their personal views with like-minded others. So we would really appreciate if any of those comments were actually kept within the audience of the event. Thank you for your understanding there. So you'll see that you have access to a chat function, comments that people hopefully will be using throughout to talk about what's being said throughout the session. Also, if you have a question which you'd like to put later to the panel, if I can ask that you actually go to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen to insert your question there. It may be that there's a similar question already which you can upvote, or if you want to just make sure that your question goes there. I'll be taking the questions from there later on and going to the most popular ones first. So if you could use that function, that would be great. We're going to hear first of all from Bernadette, then Paul and Nick, and then we'll have some polls which we're going to put to you and some time for some questions before we hear from Michelle, and then some more questions at the end of the session. Hopefully you'll find this very useful, this session. I'm sure the update for members and non-members will be particularly useful. It's great that, as I say, over 180 have registered to join us. With no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Bernadette. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Well, a very warm welcome to the West Midlands region, and we are absolutely delighted that so many members and non-members have been able to join us today. Today's virtual event replaces a planned programme of face-to-face conferences that the West Midlands Regional Executive had been working on developing. But holding it virtually with so many people just demonstrates how important it is for all of us as school leaders to be able to get together, to network, to ask questions, and to hear expert advice and guidance from our national officers. We're really delighted to have our General Secretary and our Deputy General Secretary with us today, and I know you're going to be very anxious to hear from them, and we'll have very many questions for them. Thank you to those of you who replied to our survey on the kind of topics you'd like any future events to cover. We've reviewed all those responses, and we will be organising virtual events next year. Hopefully we'll be able to get back to face-to-face at some point, but in the meantime there will be some more virtual events. The next one will be in February, so look out for that. That's going to be on the topic of wellbeing. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the man who needs no introduction, our General Secretary, Paul Whiteman, who's been leading us with great inspiration and empathy throughout the COVID crisis. So Paul, we look forward to hearing from you this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernadette, and I'm really delighted to be with you today. And I've only got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to canter through where we are very quickly. But one of the things that I normally talk about is making time for yourself and looking after yourselves in this extraordinary time. And I've managed to make sure that my family's well trained. You may have just noticed that my son brought me a cup of tea just as he came in the side of the room there. So sorry for the disturbance. But any way you can look after yourselves, I think you should exploit it whilst people are at home with you. But joking aside, we meet in the most extraordinary of times. And there's been a significant change over the last 2 weeks in terms of what members are telling me, our mailbag at the NAHT, and the contacts that we have through our assistance lines and our advice lines, and increasingly our medical assistance lines through the mental health and counselling lines that we're going through. And there's a common theme that school leaders agree that keeping schools open and keeping access to education and keeping as many children as possible in schools is the right thing to do in a long-term pandemic. That's changed from the initial response when we thought that we would shut the country down, or the government thought that we would shut the country down more or less and the thing will be under control and we've returned to normal in some way later in the year. Well, that's not happening. And although there are some good signals on the horizon, we don't think that's going to happen anytime quickly. So there seems to be some consensus about keeping schools open. But what's becoming increasingly difficult is doing that safely. And I don't just mean in response to COVID infection, but the stress and the pressure that's on the system to deliver education. And increasingly, we're getting calls, desperate calls, from members that can cope no longer, and descriptions of their teams that can cope no longer. So there's an increasing sense of desperation over the last 2 weeks. And in the last 2 weeks, I'm getting the question regularly, what's the NAHT going to do about it? And that's the conversation that we need to have with members, because it's not what I can do about it. I can lobby government. I can make the case on your behalf in the public, and we have been doing that and we'll continue to do that. But if the government doesn't respond to that, and we have to think about other avenues, that's a conversation I have to have with NAHT members about their appetite for what they might do. And I'm not there yet, but I hear the calls and I absolutely understand the desperation that sits behind those calls. And just to give you some reassurance around that before I get into some of the detail, we're calling an emergency meeting of the Union's National Executive Committee for this week, just to see where we are in that respect. And why is that? Well, that's because you, as school leaders, you have a loss of control over your schools at the moment. You don't know from day to day how many children you're going to have in class. You don't know how many members of staff you're going to have to teach them and care for them, and you're making decisions day on day on day. At the same time that the government is placing more and more expectation on your shoulders. So you still have the concern of the phonics check. Many of you are going through that right now. You're worried about statutory assessment going into the new year and all the preparations that you have to do for that, and the performance tables and the impacts of those performance tables going forward. If you've got colleagues from secondary, you're worried about the arrangements for exams and what you should be teaching now and how you prepare your students for what comes in the summer, or what the contingencies are if we have difficulties in the summer as well. We've got the spectre of inspection starting in January again, that's putting you under enormous pressure. And then on top of all of that, your budgets are shot through because there wasn't enough money anyway, and there's certainly not enough money coming through for you to deal with the pressures of the COVID response. And there's nothing from government on any of those, or certainly nothing in the public domain to bring you any relief or any hope that the thing's getting in your way from delivering great education, or the best education that you can in these difficult circumstances is coming through. So we're now getting examples of schools. It was widely reported yesterday about a trust that was changing its holiday dates around Christmas to bring some relief to the system, and that wasn't supported by government. The flexibilities that a trust was allowed have been removed apparently under the emergency powers of government. No one told us that, and I think that's a misapplication of the emergency powers. But schools trying to respond in their own way clearly aren't going to get the support of government. So what we've been doing in the run-up to all of this is trying to make the case for government that they need to remove the unnecessary pressures that are in school, the phonics check, the pressure of assessment, the lack of certainty over exams, remove the pressure of Ofsted inspection that can tell us nothing going forward. Make sure you have money at your disposal to do everything that you need to do, and don't insult us with a pay freeze either when you've stepped up and you've done everything that you need to do and your pay's been controlled for the last 10 years. So we've been making that case over the last weeks and days. And we're at a point now where we had a meeting with the Secretary of State last evening, and Nick and I have come fresh from a meeting with the Secretary of State's team this morning to impress upon them that unless we get answers to those areas now, we believe the system will fracture before we get to the Christmas break. We don't think there's enough resilience left in the system to see the level of school opening continue much beyond the next couple of weeks, as we lose more and more people to stress and illness and the pressures or the lack of support. So that's the case we're making. I'm told last night and this evening that case is being taken seriously, and there's things that we've talked about that I'm not in a position to talk to you about publicly today. If they come through, I think we will hopefully deliver some relief to the system. But if they don't, then that's going to signal that this government doesn't take the pressures in education seriously, is unwilling to do something to help you in your professional obligations in your pursuit of good education. And that then takes me into a position of what next. And what does next look like? Well, we're at the moment making sure that we've reappraised and properly understood in the context of the new government powers that they have under COVID, what your powers are and what your legal responsibilities are, so we can give you first-class advice about the flexibilities that you can exercise as school leaders, what your legal obligations are and what your legal flexibilities are. We will need to campaign with politicians and outline to backbench MPs just the destructive effect of the government's failure to act or failure to act properly on schools and the children that they're ultimately politically responsible for, to make sure that they understand too. And then we'll need to come and talk to you as members again. And the beauty of this is obviously we can only do this through the screens, but it means we can see more members more quickly to talk about what it's like in your school and what school leaders are prepared to consider if we can't bring relief to the system. So that's where we are. We absolutely get the sense of increasing desperation as it is in schools. I hope that I've reassured you that I'm not sitting in my house worrying about the longer term. We are trying to bring some relief to the system, but I have never dealt with a government that moves so slowly or is so ineffective at a time of desperation. And we are desperately trying to make sure that we can speed that up and get some relief into the system now. So I think, Natalie, for now, that's kind of setting the scene from my point of view. And I'm around for the whole thing to take questions now through the question system or however you want to play it.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Paul. We will come to some questions, but before that, we'll hear from Nick, and then we'll have questions put to the two of you, if that's okay. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to join you today. It's a bit different from the event I think that I came to this time last year in the West Midlands, where I think I was talking about our school improvement accountability report, which I seem to remember putting this on everyone's tables last year and saying this would make an ideal stocking filler for any loved ones this coming Christmas. Well, those children of yours that happily ripped off the wrapping paper to reveal that on Christmas Day will be pleased to know that we've got a follow-up this year, which is called Improving Schools. It's a report that I published last week, which attempts to set a positive vision for how we want education to be when we finally come out of this pandemic. I'm going to say a little bit about that before I finish this slot, but what I wanted to talk to you mainly about today was about inspection and accountability, and the fact that even though we're now at the end of November, we still have not got that clarity as to what's going to be happening from the start of January when it comes to inspection. When the government said that routine inspection should restart at the start of January, that was way back in June, if you recall, when we thought we were coming out of the pandemic, when infection rates were dropping and the country was starting to reopen. Well, we're not coming out of the COVID now. We're right in the middle of it, and in many places of the country, it's getting worse. Boris Johnson's hope that by Christmas we would be all clear of the pandemic has been proven to be false. So it's rather perplexing, really, that government are still sticking to their guns to say that routine inspection will return in January. Now, as Paul indicated, we're in the middle of conversations with Ofsted and with government at the moment, attempt to convince them of the error of their ways in regards to that. Put simply, there is absolutely no practical way in which routine inspection can return in January. As well, inspections rely very heavily on contribution of Ofsted inspectors serving school leaders to inspect schools, and all of the serving school leaders that I talk to who are Ofsted inspectors are absolutely clear they're not going anywhere in January. They'll be sort of having their hands full on dealing with the day-to-day, keeping their schools open and education going. The Ofsted themselves will say that it's going to be very difficult to consider how in this coming year that you are going to be able to grade schools. What would a good look like in the middle of a pandemic compared to a good that was issued before the pandemic hit in January 2020? The whole point of an Ofsted system of grading is meant to enable you to compare provision across the system. That clearly can't do that. You'll be comparing apples with pears. So the whole basis of the education inspection framework would be impossible to implement in January anyway. And apart from anything else, and the most important issue here is, frankly, this is the last thing that school leaders need right now. You know, schools are trying to keep the show on the road. They're trying to keep education going in face of confused guidance from government and a deteriorating situation sometimes by the day. The last thing we need to be doing is distracted by worrying about whether or not we should be getting Ofsted ready. And this is right, it's really important that government come forward really as quickly as possible. And they should have come forward way sooner than this in terms of giving us reassurance that routine inspection will not be continuing, we will not be starting up at the start of January. I'm hearing stories from colleagues that local authorities in some parts of the country are starting to contact their schools saying, you're likely to be in the inspection window. Let's have a conversation about how you might prepare for a return of inspection. That's the last thing that any school needs right now. So we're pushing hard to actually make sure that government absolutely understand the seriousness of this, the fact that our schools are on the edge here, that school leaders and teachers and colleagues in schools have done remarkable things over this entire period, but we're right on the edge now. And actually the last thing we need is a threat of routine inspection returning. We're talking to government about what inspection could look like in the remainder of 2020, if indeed they have a role at all. There is clear interest from government, as I've said publicly before, around what remote education looks like. But there we have enormous concerns ourselves as well about whether or not Ofsted should have any role in inspecting remote education. It's very tempting for government to try and jump to what they think the solution is when we start talking about what remote education looks like or what blended learning looks like. But the truth of all this is, nobody really knows what great remote education looks like at the moment. We're in the foothills of understanding the evidence of what makes good remote education. Is it a broadcast the likes of Oak have produced this year, where children can sit at home accessing online delivery? Or is it something completely different? Nobody's quite sure. You can't make a simple comparison between the number of hours a child sits in front of a screen, if indeed they have access to that, and whether actually proper learning takes place. So we're really cautious here about Ofsted jumping to any conclusions around what can be measured in terms of how schools have approached the remote education offer at present. But we are having those conversations with them. There could be a role for some form of thematic inspection in the spring term or in the summer term to better understand what all of that looks like. But we need to tread carefully and tread cautiously. In coming months, the likelihood is that the situation is not going to get any easier for schools, and we're aware that there are all sorts of distractions, not just inspection, which could cause increased difficulty, whether that be the increased costs that schools are facing at the moment in terms of making sure that they're COVID secure, the threat of performance tables and statutory testing, which Michelle's going to be talking about in a moment. All of this we're talking to government about at the moment, and we will be coming back out to you, as Paul said, in due course, and we're pushing them to actually give some clarity on that right now. But one thing I do think we need as we go through all of this, though, is a sense of hope. Sense of hope that actually when we do come through this crisis, and we will come through this pandemic, and we can be hopeful, I think, that the vaccine programme will start rolling out soon. But when we come out of this, that we don't just return to how education was before this pandemic hit. It will be easy to sort of think that everyone wants to rush back to normal as quickly as possible. But let's not forget that there are many fault lines in education which we were campaigning about before we actually started dealing with the current pandemic. And one of the pieces of work that NAHT have led on and produced is this one around improving schools. What that is doing is attempting to take our previous vision, where we said we need to rebalance holding schools to account with helping them to improve, and elaborate on what that actually looks like in practice. High stakes accountability, without doubt, has driven schools to prioritise quick fixes over sustainable improvement in many years. The pressure to demonstrate rapid improvements was described by Toby Greeny as being, schools encouraged to take drag and drop approaches, where it's encouraged to copy practice which appears to be working elsewhere and applying it within your own schools. Dragging and dropping effective practice is likely to result in the improvements that we want to see in schools. And our report was about getting underneath what it is that schools have to do to help them improve. The long and short of this was that school improvement takes time. It is delivered more often than not through incremental improvements in individual classrooms, day in, day out, by teachers developing their expertise and skills. Our report is saying about schools are only as good as the people that are in them. And our vision is of a system where we are valuing and investing in teachers and leaders, where we're building genuine deep collaborations between schools locally, and we are helping those colleagues that work in the most disadvantaged communities. Now, I do not expect you right now to have the time to engage with our work on our positive vision for the future of education. But I do say to you this, that whilst we are doing everything that we can to make the current situation better for you, we are also pushing government to not just return to education as it was before, but to have a higher ambition for how schools and education should be going forward. I'm going to pause there and look across to the chat bar to see some of the comments. And Natalie, do you want to sort of guide us through some of those questions that are coming forward? And we'll do our very best to get through as many of these in the time that we've got, I'd suggest. Okay,
yes, thank you. Before we move to the questions, I just want to say it's quite an interesting comment in the chat, the last comment there from Max Vlahakis. Says, I've been told to prepare to do inspections in the spring, although as yet no training has officially landed to prepare for a post-COVID education system. The DfE have cancelled the NLE support for this year, so it would be contradictory to continue inspections. So that's quite interesting. And before we move on to the questions, sorry. Yeah, Nick.
Yes, and my understanding of that is because Ofsted did write out to actually inquire about how many school leaders would, Ofsted inspectors would be prepared to be inspecting from January. And from my understanding is, on the whole, that the response they got is exactly as we would have predicted, that school leaders are not interested right now in inspecting. I think therefore, whatever plans Ofsted may feel compelled to do in the spring term, they're going to be having to cut their cloth accordingly. Interestingly, I did get some indication that some retired school leaders were more interested in undertaking Ofsted activity than those that are currently in school, but certainly not in the numbers they would need to return to routine inspection.
Okay, thank you. Just before we take the questions, I'm just going to draw people's attention to the polls, which I'm just about to launch now. You mentioned COVID costs, and actually there's a first couple of questions which we've got here. I'm going to open the first question, which the Regional Executive for West Midlands have asked for us to try and find out what people have had to do out of the following choices during the COVID-19 pandemic. So obviously not just necessarily one of those will be applicable to your school, and people have already started, which is great. So we've got sending individual pupils home, sending classes home, sending whole year groups home, and closing the school. I'll leave that open for a while we move on to some of the Q&A. And for now, what I'll do is I won't talk specifically about the testing questions because we might hear from Michelle more to do with that before we move on to those. But I'll go to this first question actually is a bit more wider. So this is from Nigel Atwood. 9 people have voted on this question. And he actually says, can I ask Paul, we're all aware that education leaders and unions are being ignored by the DfE and the government, and they keep pressing on with Ofsted exams, etc., etc. If this continues, is it time to consider what action we should take? This is from someone who feels that striking, for example, is not what I came into education for, but something has to change.
So the short answer to that question is yes, but it's what that action looks like if we're not listened to. So I have a degree more optimism that we might be listened to than I think, was it Nigel? Sorry, I didn't catch the name, that I think, Nigel, you have at the moment. But then, of course, I'm in the meetings with the Secretary of State and his team on a regular basis. But I also do have a degree of fear based upon the history of the pandemic and the management of the pandemic by the department and the government, that what I hope will come through might not materialise, or it's amended in some way or is done very badly. And just to highlight that, the experience that leads me to that potential conclusion is way back in the summer when we were talking about what it might look like for a return to schools. We were having good conversations with the department about how school leaders might begin to widen the access to school, and we were beginning to understand how that might happen, only for the Prime Minister to announce without any notice that he foresaw full return to primaries before the summer break, which was impossible to deliver based on the safety advice that had been given to schools, and that came out of the blue. So something changed between our conversations with the department and the decision of the Prime Minister. And I think we have a political difficulty that this government doesn't necessarily act collegiately, or it's all through the Prime Minister's office, and the Prime Minister's office doesn't quite understand what it's like on the ground. So that's what we're trying to battle with. But I just sense a slightly different narrative at the moment. So I have some optimism, but my experience tells me that it could go wrong. And if it does go wrong, your question is quite right. So what are we going to do then? When we need to stand up and be counted, how do we do that? Well, it's very complex right now because we don't have the normal kind of canvas upon which to paint that we normally do in industrial difficulties, because we have the emergency COVID regulations that are quite powerful, and actually the extent to which a response to a pandemic meets all of the tests that we have to meet for industrial action, I'm not sure about, and I'm taking advice about at the moment. But I think before we get to industrial action and me coming to members and saying, I'm now asking you to put your career at risk and put your personal reputation at risk with your communities to take action, which is what we do. That's why it's always the last resort. I think there's an awful lot of other things that we can do. So that's why I want to explore the powers that you have so that we can go through a system of giving you confidence as school leaders. I think we've lost our confidence in being able to push back on some of those decisions or some of the pressures that we're under, and how we do that, and how I do that in a way that breeds collective confidence in all of you, that if you're doing it, the school leader down the road is doing it too, and you're not exposing yourself as an individual. I think that political campaigning is going to be very, very important too. And I think painting that picture with, I think there was a question in there as well, so we might cover a couple here, Natalie, about the parental anxiety and parental views. I think the government has a view that simply saying schools will be open will satisfy parents, and somehow parents have the trust and confidence in the government decisions over safety that their children will be well looked after and safe, and that actually by being in school they're going to get great education. And I think we need to burst that a little bit really and begin to demonstrate, and we're waiting for the figures today, that they might well be out now but I've not seen them, about school attendance, because pupil attendance is dropping, particularly in secondary, as more and more pupils become infected with the virus, or they're having to self-isolate with their family. And that puts added pressure, you know this, it puts added pressure on schools, because you're trying to deliver home education at the same time as delivering education in schools with about a third of the workforce you normally have. And I think that's where parents begin to realise that schools can't do everything, and it begins to fracture. And we need to make sure that parents are ahead of the thinking curve on that, if you like, so that government doesn't start with a propaganda response that blames you as educators. So we need to be doing that and doing that now. So I think it's a multifaceted response. It's quite a complex response. We're in a different arena to normal industrial relations. And I think that's why you're not seeing any of the unions at the moment, and I mean at the moment by today. This could change over the next few days, because I'm constantly talking to the other trade union general secretaries. But that's why calling for strike or calling for traditional types of industrial action isn't on the lips of the other unions at the moment, because we're working out how to do that best. And I think one of the things that's on my mind constantly is how you do that and maintain that parental support and parental understanding. And just to highlight that a little bit, there's quite a debate at the moment about campaigning to close schools early into the autumn break. And the justification that's been put to me for that is that if anybody has to self-isolate, they would have self-isolated before Christmas, so they can still spend time with their families over the Christmas period. Now, I think there is a strong argument to close schools earlier, but I don't think it's removing the risk of isolation over Christmas Day and Boxing Day, because I think simply the government will respond with, well, what about those people working in supermarkets, bus drivers, train drivers, nurses, doctors, and everybody else that's risking their Christmas by potentially having to self-isolate? What's special about teachers necessarily, or what's special about children maybe putting a family at risk of self-isolation? So I don't think that's a strong argument. I think the stronger argument is there's an intolerable pressure in schools that will fracture the system, and will fracture the system so it plays into the new year as well. And we have a greater difficulty picking things up in January than we would otherwise have had. And I think choosing our arguments and choosing our justifications for actions carefully will be very, very important. And I know the trust yesterday that tried to make the arguments for an early closure was put under outrageous pressure, actually, from government. So we know where they sit on this. So we need to choose our arguments and choose our actions carefully so that we don't expose individual school leaders, but we do demonstrate the power of the collective argument and the power of collective activity if government doesn't listen to us. So I hope that reassures you that we're thinking about all of those avenues. I can't paint you a picture yet, but I will be ready to if government doesn't listen to us.
Thanks, Paul. That's obviously building on what you mentioned when you first spoke as well. So thank you for addressing Nigel's question and bringing Louise's comment into that as well about parental concern. Nick, if I can draw your attention to Oliver Wilson's question, it's got a few questions in here. The recent NAHT survey about the risks to the school system losing heads, so 47% were likely to leave sooner than planned, shows that the future could be very difficult in schools. How can the NHT support those leaders? Do the DFE realise the risk of losing a generation of head teachers early? How many middle and senior leaders are totally put off headship by what we've had to deal with since March? And are there any ideas about how this could be improved? There's 12 people who voted for that.
Yeah, okay. The fact that nearly half of the school leaders that responded to a survey, and that was over 2,000 school leaders, to say that they were considering leaving sooner than planned, you know, it should be incredibly worrying in the context, not least the fact that we were in a recruitment retention crisis anyway before we went into this crisis. Now, my argument with government on this is to say that actually, you know, what this isn't just a reaction to a reflection of the emotional and physical demands of leading a school through a crisis. You know, from the school leaders that I've been speaking to who are considering leaving, it goes much deeper than that. It goes back to a point that actually what this has done has been to make them even more aware of the fact that the direction they were pointing in as school leaders before this crisis hit isn't where their moral compass is now pointing. That there is that deep dissatisfaction with how things were before this crisis hit. What we need to do to address this is provide that hope that education will be better when we come out of this crisis than when we went into it. And government's job here is to give belief that and to convince school leaders that are wavering, that you know, give them a compelling reason to stay in the profession going forward. Now, we are calling for, you know, for government to shift their attention from holding schools to account with high stakes accountability that casts that enormous shadow over all schools into investing in teachers and leaders. The way to school improvement is by improving our skills, by investing and valuing people in schools. That's absolutely critical and important. Put your money where your mouth is, government. Show us that you value us. Show us that you value the contribution that we have made through this crisis and before. And do yourself a favour if you want to improve school by giving us the tools for the job and enabling us to access high quality professional development for all. But it's more important than that, because actually when you start looking at the figures for those coming through to headship, we've got a serious problem here. Too few teachers aspire to be a head teacher. Those that do are often poorly supported to, you know, on their journey to headship. And around 30% of new heads leave within 3 years. This is completely unsustainable. We've got a sink or swim mentality for leadership, which choose and throws out far too many people. We need to value, we need to nurture, we need to scaffold new leaders to enable them to be successful. We've been calling since 2018 in our Accountability Commission report, and we reaffirm it in the Improving Schools report, that government needs to put together a head teacher support package to give that proper support to those new impacts in exactly the same way as they've just done it for early career teachers, recognising that far too many recently qualified teachers leave because they haven't got the support around them. Precisely the same conditions exist for leadership. Government need to invest in leadership, and they need to show that there is a better future ahead, that next year will be better than last year, and the year after that will be even better still. And until they do that, I think we are facing a very serious problem, which frankly will undermine all of our efforts to improve schools if we haven't got the talented and experienced school leaders in charge in our schools. Shall I pick up while I'm here just a couple of the comments that came through, Natalie?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm looking at, you know, the question from, so I'm just scrolling through now. Kathy, you talked about the National Tutoring Programme as well. I'll just very quickly refer to that. I think the National Tutoring Programme in the long term has potential to be a useful source of support to schools. You know, the evidence from Education Endowment Foundation suggests that small group one-to-one tuition can help. But the problem with this is that it's been badged as being a catch-up strategy for schools. That's complete, you know, that puts it in completely the wrong space. It will take years for a cadre of tutors, which schools can access in every part of the country, to be in place, properly trained, and with the skills that they need in order to provide a useful role to schools. And the attempt to actually just badge this as a media-friendly initiative, which shows that government are taking action to help schools catch up, I think is real problematic. And it's problematic not least that, you know, when at the end of the year insufficient tutors have come forward or schools have not been able to access it, it will be seen as a failure, and will you know, that be consigned to the bin for the next 10 years. I think there is something good within the national tutoring programme, but I'm really concerned that we're focusing too much on it as part of a catch-up strategy, which it is not. I've used the phrase, the cavalry are going to be coming over the hill far too late for catch-up, and I think that's absolutely right. We've got some questions as well. There was a point about remote learning, which I think was emphasising the point that I was making earlier as well, about Ofsted not being in a position to evaluate against that, and that's absolutely right. Ofsted inspections as well, you know, work against a framework. There is no framework for remote education because there is no evidence at this point in terms of what good is. So other than them going into schools to identify what interesting practice might look like, and I use the phrase interesting practice rather than effective, you know that I don't think they can make a role on that. They can identify what schools are doing, which appears to be having some positive impact, but they can't actually at this point be evaluating what they think good or excellent practice actually is. So they might have a role in helping us to gather it and move knowledge around the system, but I don't think they can have a role for evaluating it as yet. Natalie, do you want to draw attention to any questions that are coming through as well? Well, it's got a lot of votes. Should just look to the top of the list, frankly, shouldn't I? Sarah, the emergency powers, yes. Very concerned about the government's emergency powers, which is where the remote education requirements have come in. Paul, have you got any reflections on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the government's decision to adopt the emergency powers was a mistake. But it's clear that, I mean, what that underlines is that the government doesn't really want to understand the pressures, get alongside you as professionals and find solutions. It wants top-line political messages to try and maintain overall political control. And what it wants to do is it wants to talk tough. And actually, one of the difficulties that I think we have in education is it would quite suit a government right now to have a little bit of an argument with educators and to paint a picture of education as being the public service that isn't on board and isn't alongside the country's response to the pandemic. It is making so many mistakes in terms of how it's dealing with it. Being able to find someone or a profession to blame will quite suit it. And I think that's what the government does. It runs to talk tough and look like it's acting tough. And it tries to push the complexities away. And that's where I spotted just something in the chat there about how we motivate the electorate and how we get into the heads of the electorate, the failures of government. And I think that's a powerful response. I think the only difficulty about that response is we're some years away from an election. So that they feel quite content at the moment that that's not a fear. But I think it's important to put backbench MPs under pressure and make sure that their constituents know what's going on with their schools as well, and that actually simply saying we can force schools to do things doesn't make it happen. And what we'll do is we'll push the profession into a period of compliance to basic minimums, rather than allowing you the freedom and the professionalism to come up with great and innovative responses to very particular times. And you've proved that. My biggest regret is that government thinks it knows how to do this better than you, when you've proved throughout this pandemic, time and time again, right from the interpretation of the essential workers list, which included everybody at the start, the interpretation and delivery of that, through to free school meals, through to looking after the most vulnerable children and making sure children receive some form of education at home, through the exams fiasco, right the way through that, and then through the return to school. You've proved that no matter how bad the government advice, how poor they are, you will make it work on behalf of children. So I think it's an absolute insult that the government suggests that it needs such powers, and will deal with you as a profession in that way. So there's an element of anger there as well, but neither can we fall into the trap of allowing the government to paint us as the profession or the public service that's working against the overall response. So our response has to be powerful, but it has to be well thought through as well. And getting the electorate on board and educating the electorate will certainly be part of that response.
Thanks, Paul and Nick. I think what we'll do before we move on to some of the questions, because the most popular questions now that are coming up are along the lines of testing, right from the Key Stage 2 SATs up to GCSEs. So before we introduce Michelle into the discussion, just to say thank you for those of you who've taken part in that first poll. Not surprisingly, 90% of you have had to send individual pupils home, half of you have had to send classes or whole year groups home, and 12% have actually had to close the whole school. I'm going to introduce another poll quickly, which is before as I say before we hear from Michelle. So poll number 2 is regarding COVID costs. If you're able to just answer that whilst we wait a moment to go into Michelle's segment. It's just asking you approximately how much money you spent this term on COVID related costs, and that includes supply. So there's a few choices there, if I could leave that with you. Thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to Michelle.
Thanks, Natalie. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give you a bit of background on our position with regard to assessment in primary school. I'll tell you how our efforts to cancel statutory testing next year started and the progress that's been made so far. At our national conference in October, I proposed a motion asking for all testing in primary school to be cancelled in 2021 due to the effect the pandemic was having on the education and the mental well-being of children, and the anxiety of teachers and parents. After this motion was passed, it then became NAHT policy, and the team at headquarters began to work on it immediately. As well as the action NAHT are taking, other groups have also been campaigning for primary statutory tests to be dropped next year. And you may have seen social media about the Drop SATs 2021 campaign. This actually refers to all primary testing, so maybe it should be called the Drop the Phonics Screening Check in Year 2, the Phonics Screening Check in Year 1, Key Stage 1 Statutory Assessments in Year 2, the Multiplication Test in Year 4, and the Key Stage 2 Statutory Assessments in Year 6 campaign. It isn't quite as snappy, but it would, on the other hand, illustrate that the children in 4 out of the 7 primary years will, in this most stressful of all years, be tested in formal conditions. The DfE policy was stated quite clearly in September. It said, "We recognise that pupils will have missed a critical period of their education due to lockdown in the 2019 to 2020 academic year. It is vital that we know the impact of coronavirus on this cohort of pupils nationally and can give support to schools that need it the most. We are therefore planning on the basis that statutory primary assessments will take place in summer 2021. Well, we'd all agree that it is vital that the DfE knows the impact of the coronavirus on the children's education, but to save them some time, I, or for that matter any teacher, could tell them now. The children are happy to be back in school, but they have been greatly affected by the time they have missed. Many of them are anxious, some of them have been bereaved and are grieving. School is a very different place. They can only mix with the children in their bubble. When they pass teachers or children in other parts of the school, they can't stop to chat as they usually do. There are no whole school events. Under these circumstances, it is hard to promote the happy family atmosphere that should be felt in every primary school. But we are doing our best. To impose formal statutory tests on these children would increase the anxiety that we are working so hard to diminish. Nick Gibb has admitted that statutory testing is purely for accountability purposes. He said that SATs are, and I quote, "not about the future of that particular young person who takes the test." Well, surely everything we do in school should be about the future of our young people. Isn't that what we're all about? But setting that aside, if it is purely for accountability, how can we possibly use test results from this year as an accountability measure when the children would have had vastly different amounts of time in school and vastly different input at home during lockdown? Any results would be useless from these tests. So if their prime purpose of the test is for accountability, we'll be putting our children and staff through this extra stress for no good reason. Our purpose in primary school is to prepare the children for the next stage of their education. They will need to have gained the skills that will ensure they'll make excellent progress when they leave us. That includes emotional intelligence, so that they will be resilient, able to solve problems, have the confidence to be creative, and basically have a love of learning and the curiosity which they all have in early years, and which we systematically knock out of them as they progress through the school, taking test after test. Every school leader wants to be held to account and knows that this is essential to providing a good education system. But the accountability measures should not be detrimental to the education or well-being of our children, and should not cause an unacceptable level of stress to our school leaders and teachers. All schools, being part of their local communities, have been hugely important in mitigating the effects of the virus, from providing food where necessary to ensuring regular contact with families in need and helping out generally in every way possible. As such, it's vital to consider the views of our community, and in particular the parents. I asked our parents their opinions on the question of statutory testing this year, and their responses were exactly what I expected. 94% of those who responded said that their child's mental health was the most important consideration in returning to school. When we asked them what they felt was the best way of ascertaining gaps in their education, 94% said, again, that the best way was a personal assessment by their child's teacher, including some informal tests. Only 4% said formal statutory tests. So the NAHT have lost no time in making our position clear to the DfE and the Secretary of State. A great deal of work has been done, and it's also been made clear to them that this is urgent, as the phonics test in Year 2 is happening now. I've received numerous phone calls and emails about phonics screening with school leaders, varying from the furious at the pressure this is creating to desperate, as they can't see how they can possibly manage this screening with staff and children isolating or shielding, and without a spare teacher or suitable space to carry out the assessment. Advice on our website is clear, and I've noticed that it has been put on the chat. And it states that the union is currently assessing the legal status of these tests and the possible options available to both the union as a whole and to individual members. There are, as we gleaned from what Paula said, some positive noises being made, and we're expecting an announcement from the government to be made quite soon. My fear, and I think this is shared quite widely, is that they may say that the children should take the tests, but that they would not be used for accountability purposes or to compare schools. Well, that would be unacceptable, because for a start off, the children would still have the stress of taking the tests, and the time spent preparing for them would be wasted when we have other more productive things to do in the classroom. It's also impossible to say that schools won't be held accountable. Local authorities, CEOs of academy trusts and the press could easily use data to compare schools. Other teaching unions hold similar views, and there are also various campaign groups who are actively working to get testing dropped next year. One group that's been mentioned today is More Than a School. They have produced a template which school leaders can use to lobby their MPs on this matter. One of our local heads did this and got a response which was clearly a standard email. The fact that a standard response is being sent out is in one respect encouraging, because it implies that a lot of MPs are being emailed about this, but it also shows that this issue is not thought to be important enough to be worthy of a considered response. So to sum up, at the moment we are waiting to see what the legal advice is around the phonics test and what the government suggests with regard to that and other tests. When they make an announcement, the membership will then have to decide what our response will be and what action, if any, we need to take. So if the government announcement is some sort of fudge, for example, saying the test will go ahead but won't be used for accountability purposes, and members ask, well, what are the NAHT doing about this? I would say, you are the NAHT. What do you want us to do? As Paul said earlier, we all share the responsibility, and we all need to be active if we want to get through these challenging times while looking after the mental health of our children and staff and continuing to provide a wide and useful education. So Natalie, that's the update, and I assume there's lots of questions for everybody on that one.
Thank you. That's really good to hear from you, Michelle, there. And actually, it's interesting, a few people have commented in the Q&A, in fact, but a few people have commented to say that they'd be very interested in some kind of standard survey to match yours, which either an NAHT as a whole or possibly the West Midlands region to work on. So that's something to take away from this. Thank you. What we'll do is we can go, I won't go to the polls just yet. The first question that comes to the top there is from Kathy Walsh. 13 people have voted on it. It says, can I ask when we'll hear that a sensible approach to Key Stage 2 SATs is planned, i.e. teacher assessment? So that's kind of building on what you just said. You know, at the moment, we're just waiting to hear, aren't we? I don't think we can necessarily explore that much further unless someone thinks something different.
I think it's just worth saying, Natalie, really quickly, we're in that difficult territory right now where the frustration and desperation on the ground isn't matched by a government response. So we're in that difficult situation where we're talking to government. We know that they're considering our position and our options and what we've said, but we haven't had the response. Now, we do hope we get that response very, very shortly, and that's what I was impressing upon the Secretary of State when I met him last night, that actually the failure to say something is putting as much pressure on people's shoulders because of the unknown and the expectation as anything else. And then if the response isn't good enough, we then get into the territory that Michelle was talking about then, about coming back out to members and saying, look, this is what they've said. Is it good enough? If it is, fantastic. If it's not, what do we do? So that's where we are. But I don't think we can allow government much more time than kind of this week before we have to start saying very publicly that the pressure is intolerable.
Yeah, thank you. And interestingly, the next sort of the most popular is actually a comment on there, which says, it's from Debbie Colley. It says that we boycotted SATs in 2010. As much as I don't like the idea of action, I think we need to seriously consider doing this again. Children will simply not be ready, and we're setting them up to fail. And there's been 12 people who are in agreement with that. Just a reminder.
Just really quickly and specifically about a SATs boycott, because we do have some experience of that, and it lives long in the minds of our members that took part in that. My approach to this right now is to almost segment the difficulties and the different levels of pressure will begin to weaken our argument. So I don't look at the pressures that you're under as school leaders at the moment, or particularly under SATs, as an isolated problem. And if we simply try and deal with SATs, actually I think the power of our argument is weakened, and our ability to build that collective endeavour and that collective sense of anger will be weakened, because there will be some members, as we experienced in the last SATs boycott, that aren't motivated in a similar way to others and don't observe it. And we need to build a response that's very powerful. And when you talk about phonics, assessment, exams, Ofsted funding and a pay freeze, that actually touches everybody's nerve points on there. So I like to talk about SATs at the moment in the round, rather than are we going to take particular action just on SATs. I'm not saying we never would, but I'm just saying at the point we're at the moment with the level of pressure, we need a response from government that ticks all of those boxes rather than a single box.
Okay, thank you. Kind of moving up to the other end of the scale, the other end of schooling. If I can just ask this from Alistair Black. Are there any indications that the government might fall into line with Scotland and Wales with their approach to GCSEs? I'm aware of some Year 11 pupils who've currently been sent home for a second period of 14 days, another month of vital education gone. You'll all be aware of how unfair it is when some children would have lost even more time than this, but others might have missed no time at all.
Nick, do you want to pick that one up, or do you want me to deal with it?
Yeah, I can pick it up. It's again, this is one of the aspects that we're in deep conversation with the DFE, with Ofqual and others as well. It's one of these areas which, frankly, it should have been resolved months ago. It should have been, there should have been some clarity as to what was going to be happening in terms of examinations next year when schools started back in September. Even if that was a case of like, there are two scenarios here. These are the paths we will be on, depending on how the virus pans out. The fact that we're at the end of November, we're still out without that clarity is quite frankly scandalous. Now at the moment, we've got sort of government that are absolutely committed to ensuring that examinations run next year. What we're arguing for is to say that actually we need to make sure that, given the varied experience that young people will have had, not just between schools but within schools, we need to have a system that ensures that young people are assessed on the work that they've been able to do and takes full account of the circumstances that they found themselves in, but are completely outside of their control. In many ways, it makes last year's award of exam look like a walk in the park, when you had actually at least all schools broadly having had the same experience and the pupils within them, in that the schools closed on the same day in March. This year, everyone's having a different experience. We need to make sure that what the system that we end up with ensures that it fairly recognises the talent and ability of every young person. It can't come down to algorithms as well, we all agree. Examinations may well play a role within that, but we need to see some flexibility within that so that young people are not sitting exams on aspects of the syllabus that they've had very little opportunity to engage with through circumstances wholly out of their control. So we are deep in discussion on that. We are hoping to get some clarity on that very soon. Paul, anything further?
No, I think that covers it, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What we'll have to do is actually move away from the questions now. We've had, hopefully, while we've been going through some of them, the others' comments and questions have been picked up into the answers quite well. And if there is anything else which we haven't addressed, and there is an awful lot of questioning around Ofsted, around COVID costs as well, that we haven't really had much of a chance to touch on. Unfortunately, these briefings, we know there's so much to talk about and so much to cover, we can't ever seem to get to the end of it. But we will be looking at that as a region, and also within the policy team of NAHT as well, if there's anything which we can sort of feed into our FAQs, which is linked in the chat, as Michelle mentioned, the updated position on the Year 2 phonics testing and the latest report from the Improvement Commission as well, which Nick was referring to. Before we hear very briefly again from Paul, I'm just going to go to the polls. Thank you very much for taking part in that. It looks like the majority of people have so far had 5,000 to 10,000 who've responded to that on COVID costs. And the final poll I'm just going to launch, because this is going to help the West Midlands Regional Executive next week in their discussions around, in their next meeting, their next executive meeting. They're asking which of these 5 areas you would prefer to put forward for your branch to work on as a regional motion for next year's national conference. So there's a choice of 5 areas, which has now been launched. If you could select for me, please. There's funding, Ofsted, assessment, SEND, and pay and conditions. Thank you very much for doing that. Obviously, it's a regional update, so it's great to have your input into the decisions within that region. I'm going to thank Nick and thank Michelle for joining us before we very briefly hear from Paul again.
Thanks, Natalie. Well, I think all it leaves for me to say really is, one, to give a very heartfelt thank you to you and your teams for everything that you're doing in schools, despite the government consistently putting barriers and difficulties in your way. When we talk about who has children's interest truly at heart, it is the profession, it is you, it is your teams that have that. And I'm afraid, from my point of view at the moment, it's a political headline that the government cares about education and keeping schools open, because it's such an unsophisticated and ill-timed response. And the moment they wake up to your professionalism and dedication and allow you to get on with it and give you the support you need and remove the barriers and frustrations, the quicker we will be in a position to recover the lost education that children have suffered and deliver education in a way that truly is a good response to the effects of the pandemic. And I picked up one comment in there, I think it was from Debbie, about disadvantage and how disadvantage is being compounded by the pandemic. And we hear from government on that, but it remains on the shoulders of a footballer to push the government to do the right things over feeding children. And they ignore the efforts that you made in terms of delivering food during the first part of the pandemic and everything else. And why did they move? Because of public opinion. And that's where it really takes me. In whatever we do, however we campaign for change, it's going to be on the back of public opinion that we're successful as much as anything else. So all of those comments about motivating the opinions of parents and staff and the wider public become very, very important. And I think we need to get into the consciousness of the public that you are a frontline service, you are the centre of your communities, and you're the glue that's holding those communities together. And you need admiration and support from them, not just me, to make sure they understand your position, they understand the difficulties, and you get that understanding and support that is so necessary to be able to look after the nation's children. Because if we don't, actually, we're going to pay for it for decades. Because it's the children that are in the education system now that are going to have to sort out the damage of COVID in the long term, the opportunities or damage of Brexit. And if we can't deliver an education that's real rather than headlines for government, then we will all pay for it in the longer term. And that's where we get into the electorate as well. So can I just assure you, we've got it. I know you want me to be able to flick a switch and relieve the pressure. That's not a power that's at the fingertips of a trade union general secretary, but I will use every power that we do have, including the power of your collective effort, and building arguments and building coalitions with other unions and other interested parties to try and get this government to make the right decisions. But thank you very much for the invitation today. Thank you for being free with your comments and your questions, because it's those comments and questions that feed what I say to government and will feed what I say to government this afternoon when we meet them again. So I'm delighted to have been here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Bernadette, as well. So just nothing really for me to say other than, if you have missed something on this, or if you want to watch a replay or share it, there will be a link which will be shared with you later on. And do look out for the national broadcast, which we're also continuing to do within NAHT. We have one aimed at school business leaders, one aimed at small and rural schools coming up soon, so your inbox will have details of them. If you do want to join us, if you're not a member, please visit our website. If you are a member and you'd like to become more involved, perhaps within your local branch, please also visit our website. And thank you. Thank you very much for your time.